you are joining us from. And of course, if you are on the West Coast, North America, or close to or past the dateline, then a good, very early morning to you. It's a distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you panelists, our participants, the attendees, to this very important and very topical roundtable discussion dedicated to the issue of US-Israel relations, especially in the light of the current, recently concluded, soon to be called decisive American presidential election. This is a very topical issue, of course. Many people around the world, many people who care about the future of US-Israel relations, the future of Israel in the Middle East, of course, care about this, and know that many of you guests and participants will have lots of questions to this very distinguished lineup of panelists. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I'm the director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies based at Concordia University in Montreal. And it is really my honor to bring this distinguished lineup of speakers to you at an event that is brought to you in cooperation among the Association for Israel Studies and the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel at Michigan State University, as well as, of course, the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. With your permission, I'm going to introduce briefly, which is going to be very difficult because of their stellar list of accomplishments, the four speakers who will take their turn and speak for about 15 minutes each on this topic, on the issues about America-Israel relations. And then we will open up the floor for exchanging views, allowing the speakers to respond to each other. And then we will welcome your questions, both in the chat, as well as if you wish, we will be able to call upon you so that you could ask your questions directly to the panelists or to the entire panel. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, the Ambassador Dr. Daniel C. Kurtzer, who is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. During a 29-year career in the United States Foreign Service, Ambassador Kurtzer served as the United States Ambassador to Israel and as the United States Ambassador to Egypt. He was also a speechwriter and member of the Secretary of State George Shultz's policy planning staff. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. He is the co-author of two important publications, Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, as well as The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace in 1989 and 2011. Ambassador Kurtzer is also editor of Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Ambassador Kurtzer received his PhD in political science from Columbia University. Our second speaker is Dr. Yael Aronoff, who is the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel. And she is also the Serling Chair in Israel Studies at Michigan State University. Dr. Aronoff is Associate Professor of International Relations at James Madison College as well. She is the president of the Association of Israel Studies. Her book, The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers, When Hardliners Opt for Peace, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. And recently, very recently, she co-edited a book with Dr. Ilan Peleg and Dr. Saliba Sarsar entitled Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond. And the book is published hot off the press as we speak in November 2020 by Lexington Books. Currently, Dr. Aronoff is working on a book manuscript about the dilemmas of asymmetric conflicts, navigating deterrence and democratic constraints. She's widely published in several journals, to mention but a few: Foreign Policy, Israel Studies Review, and Political Science Quarterly. Dr. Aronoff was awarded the Michigan State University Teacher Scholar Award in 2011, and the Michigan State University John K. Hudzik Emerging Leader in Advancing International Studies and Programs Award in 2015. She has served as Assistant for Regional Humanitarian Programs in the Pentagon's Office of Humanitarian and Refugee Affairs and in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a Jacob K. Javits Fellow. She was Senior Associate at Columbia University's Institute of War and Peace Studies. Our third speaker is Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Wittis, who is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where she focuses on United States policy in the Middle East. Dr. Kaufman-Wittis served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating United States policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. Dr. Kaufman-Wittis is a co-host of Rational Security, a weekly podcast on foreign policy and national security issues. Last year, she published a report with Yael Mizrach-Arnaud entitled, "Is Israel in Democratic Decline?" This important work examines the impact of populist politics on the health of Israel's democratic institutions. Dr. Wittis is the author of Freedom's Unsteady March, America's Role in Building Arab Democracy, published by the Brookings Institution Press in 2008. And she's also editor of How Israelis and Palestinians Negotiate, a cross-cultural analysis of the Oslo peace process, published in 2005. She holds a bachelor's in Judaic and Near Eastern Studies from Oberlin College and a master's and doctorate in government from Georgetown University. She's a founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security and serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Women in International Security. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Jonathan Reinhold, Deputy Head of the Department of Political Studies and Director of the Argov Center for the Study of Israel and the Jewish People at Bar-Ilan University, where she's also a senior researcher at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. Reinhold received his PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1998. In 2012 to 13, he was the Schusterman Visiting Professor of Israeli Politics at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. His research broadly focuses on US-Israeli relations, Israel and the peace process, and the role of political culture in international relations. His book, entitled The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, published by Cambridge University Press, won the Israeli Association for Political Science Prize for the Best Book of 2015. The book received praise from, amongst others, Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, as well as David Makovsky, a former senior advisor to the United States Secretary of State, John Kerry. In January 2016, Dr. Reinhold co-edited a volume entitled United States Foreign Policy and Global Standing in the 21st Century. Dr. Reinhold also is regularly interviewed by a wide variety of news outlets, including but a few, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Reuters, CNN, USA Today, and many more. He takes pride in having taken a leading role in combating the academic boycott of Israel in the United Kingdom and served as an advisor to the Israeli Foreign Ministry and diaspora Jewish organizations on combating the BDS movement. At this important panel today, Dr. Reinhold is also a distinguished lecturer of the Association for Israel Studies. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me give you the panelists, the panel, by asking the Ambassador and Kurtzer to open us up. Ambassador, please.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the invitation, and thank you to the sponsors of this event. It's really wonderful to be on this very distinguished panel with colleagues. Before starting off on the question that we were asked, which is US policy in the upcoming Biden administration, I think it's important to note that the Trump administration is not yet finished. And in fact, there are still a number of issues, including some that were undertaken this week, that are being attempted to change the dynamics in a way that will make it challenging for the Biden administration to act. This relates not only to Israel and the Middle East peace process, but also to a number of leaders and countries in the region who have held Trump in very high esteem for things that he's done for them. For example, the United Arab Emirates arms deal. Certainly, we know that that ushered in a normalization agreement, a treaty with Israel, which is a quite good thing, but they also got out of it F-35s that they've been, or presumably will get out of it, F-35s that they have been seeking for many years. The Saudis got a lot of arms deals. They were given a free pass on the assassination of Adnan Khashoggi. They've been given a free pass on human rights and their involvement in Yemen. The Egyptians have been given a relative free pass on human rights and have gotten American support for their dispute with Ethiopia with respect to the Renaissance Dam. The Turks have gotten a relative free pass with respect to their purchase of S-400 anti-aircraft system from Russia. And of course, we know the long list of benefits that the Trump administration delivered to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government over the past 4 years, much of which will be the subject of today's discussions. I would also note that Trump, who fancies himself a deal maker, got very little out of these deals. In fact, the one that he probably invested the most in, which was in the benefits that he provided to Netanyahu, did not deliver for him the support among the American Jewish community that he expected. And you remember that some months ago, he said that American Jews who don't vote for him are in a way disloyal to the state of Israel. So Trump has offered a number of bennies to at least 5 of the leaders in countries in the Middle East. And that continues. We saw this week with the visit to Israel of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, first secretary to visit an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, apparently done because they named a wine after him, but obviously done because he's probably going to run for president in 2024 and is looking for photo ops, visited the Golan Heights as well. Changes made in the degree to which the binational foundations, 3 of them that the United States and Israel have had for quite a long time, are now able to fund projects in the West Bank. The change of adding Israel to the passports of Israelis who are born in Jerusalem. And the question is, what else can be done over these next almost 60 days that will specifically be designed to complicate the presidency of Joe Biden? The Biden transition team is upholding the view that there is only one president at a time. And unlike Trump in 2016, who got directly involved in the Security Council debate over what became a Security Council resolution that the Obama administration abstained on, the Biden group is basically taking a back seat and not getting involved in these activities right now, focused more on the transition, which is complicated, as we know, and appointments about which we're probably going to hear more this week. At the same time, one can be fairly certain that there is a great deal of planning going on for what might be called reversibility. In other words, what is it that a Biden administration can do to undo some of the things with which it disagrees that the Trump administration did? And that's also going to be complicated. Some of those issues can be handled by executive orders, but most of them, in fact, will need some degree of congressional support or active buy-in in order to restore what had happened in the status quo ante. Now, in thinking about reversibility, it's important to note, even though we're focused on the US-Israeli relationship, that in terms of a Biden administration's agenda, all of these issues are going to represent a significantly low priority. Number one, Biden is likely to focus significant attention and keep very much center on his desk domestic issues. Certainly COVID, not only in the United States, but around the world, immigration, race relations, economic inequalities, infrastructure. I can go down the long list, which you're familiar with, but the point is that for Biden, these are the most pressing issues on the national agenda. When he turns to foreign policy, you're looking at a question of returning or not returning directly into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. In other words, how to deal with an Iranian nuclear program that has expanded dramatically since 2018 when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. What do you do with China that has become far more assertive on the international scene than it had been just a few years ago? How to handle relations with Russia, what to do about the climate accord. In other words, even on the foreign policy agenda, until you get to the Middle East, you run through a significant number of higher priorities. And when you turn to the Middle East after the JCPOA, you have to think about the endemic protracted conflicts with which the United States and others need to deal. Syria, Yemen, Libya, possibility of the Ethiopia and Egypt dispute widening, resumption of hostilities in Western Sahara involving Morocco and the Polisario. And all of a sudden you realize that on this extremely complex foreign policy agenda, what those of us who've worked on the Arab-Israeli conflict for many years are looking at is a relatively low priority that the next president will assign to this issue. So the question is whether or not in this context, a President Biden can produce some constructive changes. And the reality is that in two very important respects, his ability to do so will be in many ways dependent on the willingness of the two major partners in the Israeli-Palestinian issue to actually step forward and do their part. And so you're left with two question marks. Number one, will Prime Minister Netanyahu decide to meet Biden somewhere halfway on issues that are important to both countries? We've already seen signals being sent by Israel's ambassador to the United States, who tweeted the view that the United States should not re-enter the JCPOA. Apparently, the Prime Minister either said or tweeted the same thing today. In other words, the Prime Minister is laying down a marker designed to make it much more challenging for the administration to make its own decisions with respect to how to handle Iran. The question is also going to be whether or not the Prime Minister goes ahead with some of the activities that seem to be in train that also are designed, in a sense, to complete some activities before Biden enters office. I'm thinking, for example, of the large number of settlement housing that for which contracts or papers need to be signed before Biden enters office in Givat HaMatos, an area that's very important with respect to the question of whether or not the West Bank and East Jerusalem will be cut off from one another, and therefore make it more challenging to deal with that issue in a possible peace settlement. At the same time, on the other side of the line, equal number of challenges with respect to President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. We saw this week that he has agreed to resume coordination with Israel. But what does that mean in terms of ongoing security cooperation with respect to the normal bilateral dialogue between Israel and the Palestinian Authority? What does it mean in terms of what's called in the United States the pay for slay issue? In other words, will the Palestinians find a way to deal with this question of providing payments to the families of those who have been involved in terrorism? An issue which is not only critical in its own right, but also becomes important with respect to whether or not the United States can resume assistance to Israel, given the reality of what's called the Taylor Force Act that prohibits such assistance as long as the Palestinians are providing assistance to the families of terrorists. The point is that in some major respects, the degree to which the Biden administration will have incentives to move forward on any issue relating to Israel or Israel-Palestine will be dependent to a large degree on the degree to which both Netanyahu and Abbas are prepared to work constructively and fruitfully with the Biden administration. And that leads me to the question of what's a realistic notion of what Biden could do? And I would deal with this question on a what I call a realistic plane, because there's obviously a second tier of what those involved in the peace process would love him to do, but are probably realistically not expecting him to do. So a realistic notion of what Biden might be able to do is, number one, make sure that the region understands that the so-called Trump vision is no longer US policy. We can, in the discussion period, review all of its shortcomings. There are obviously some issues that the Israelis would like to retain, probably many issues, but for most of the world, for most of the region, and certainly for the incoming Biden administration, the Trump vision is a non-starter, and Biden will likely find a way to pull it off the table and to reiterate in public statements or press releases longstanding US views on a two-state solution, on opposition to settlements, and similar issues. Number two, on the question of Jerusalem, Biden administration is not likely to move the embassy of the United States back to Tel Aviv. President-elect Biden has made clear that he's not going to do that. But he can find a way, at least rhetorically, to put Jerusalem, quote unquote, back on the table for future peace negotiations. You recall that in 2017, when the Trump administration moved the embassy, President Trump himself said that that effectively put Jerusalem off the table, which sent a message to the Palestinians that, in a sense, the United States would not support their aspiration for a capital in East Jerusalem. Biden can find a way to put it back on the table in a manner that gets us back to where we were before the Trump administration. Third, the United States can find a way to restore the institutions of dialogue with Palestinians by reopening the PLO office in Washington and opening a consulate either in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank as a channel of communication to the Palestinians. Both of these will require some degree of congressional support, probably not a high cost or a high price that needs to be paid, but it should be a priority for the administration if it wants to resume a normal dialogue with Palestinians who, both because of the Trump administration's policies and their own policies, have not had an official dialogue with the American administration now, basically since the beginning of 2018. With regard to aid to the Palestinian Authority and to the UN Relief and Works Agency, both of these will require some degree of congressional support. I mentioned already the Taylor-Force Act, but the United States will obviously try to find a way to restore some of that aid in order to resume what had been a fruitful relationship before 2016. There are two, what I would call long shot possibilities, which are not in the realm of a big peace process plan. One is a reiteration of the US view on the illegality of settlements, which was first articulated in the 1970s and was changed about a year and a half ago, I think it was, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that the new legal position of the United States is that settlements were not illegal. It is possible at some point that a Biden administration would simply restore the legal opinion offered by the then legal advisor, Herbert Hansel, which declared settlements to be illegal under international law. I call it a long shot because in a sense, it doesn't gain much immediately for the United States, but it would put the house back in order, as it were. And a second long shot is how the Biden administration deals with Trump's recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. As I've said elsewhere, including in congressional testimony, Trump administration was rather foolish in this regard because Israel itself, at the time of the laws that extended administration jurisdiction over the Golan Heights, made quite clear that this was not an act of extending sovereignty. And so the United States, in recognizing Israel's sovereignty, recognized something that even the Israeli government had not done in the 1980s when this law was adopted. So it's possible that the Trump administration could undo it, or it could simply ignore it in practical terms. It stays out there essentially meaningless. Let me conclude with two things, the do's and the don'ts that might be suggested to the parties themselves. With respect to Israel, it's unwise to be announcing large settlement plans at this time. And as I mentioned, Givat HaMatos is really a thumb in the eye of the incoming Biden administration. Prime Minister, the government can pull back that tender and decide later whether it wants to go ahead with it, but not to start out on that foot with the Biden administration. Secondly, I think Netanyahu himself needs to find a way to make clear to President-elect Biden that he has not or will not continue to vote Republican with respect to American politics. In other words, some of the activities that took place over these past, not just 4 years, but the past 12 years, need to be reversed if a good relationship is to be developed between a Netanyahu-led government and a Biden administration. And third, and I'll be very direct here, is the sooner that the current Israeli ambassador is brought home, the better. Washington needs a fresh start with the ambassador designate. I think it's Gilad Erdan, if I'm not mistaken. And it would just be wise for Ambassador Dermer, who served here for an extraordinary long period of time, and I think for Israel, he was a good ambassador, to go home and to get a fresh start on that respect. For Palestinians, the two do's and don'ts: number one, fix the problem that prompted the Taylor Force legislation. And number two, stop complaining and start thinking creatively. All we've heard during this period of Arab normalization with Israel are complaints, condemnations, and criticisms. And we've heard no creative thinking from Palestinians, and it's really very important for them to do so. So why don't I stop there and pass the floor back to you, Dr. Csaba.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kurtzer. Thank you for those important insights. And now, Dr. Aronoff, Yael, the floor is yours.
Well, it's an honor to be on this panel with esteemed scholars and practitioners, and I see now 101 participants listening from around the world. Ambassador Kurtzer is always a hard act to follow, but I'm going to look at 5 interlocking ways in which the Biden administration is likely to enhance Israeli-American relations to the mutual benefit of both countries. Cooperating in these 5 mutually reinforcing ways will enhance both countries' security broadly defined. In most areas, Biden will be engaging in a process of repairing, restoring, and rejuvenating a relationship that appeared at the surface to be at its heyday, but in actuality was on its way to possibly leading to deterioration beneath that surface had Trump been reelected. So first, Biden will try to curtail Iran's nuclear capabilities and regional influence while continuing the commitment to preserve Israel's qualitative military edge and military and intelligence cooperation between the two countries. And Ambassador Kurtzer referred to those efforts in Netanyahu's tweet to try to abort those. It's often contrary to some mischaracterizations that Trump improved US and Israeli security through leaving the Iran deal negotiated by the previous administration. Again, as Ambassador Kurtzer also outlined, Iran now has more than twice the amount of fissile material necessary for a nuclear weapon, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's power has increased, pushing that nuclear program ahead while increasing its regional influence. It's now establishing a system to launch rockets at Israel from Syria when needed. There are Shiite militias from Iraq throughout Syria, and terrorist networks on the Syrian-Israeli border operated by the Revolutionary Guards and others by Hezbollah. There are many Israelis that have applauded some of Trump's symbolic moves, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, but in many ways, Iran has been emboldened. So Biden is likely to try to renegotiate an Iran deal, as difficult as that may be, but certainly in communication with Israel, and they could start moving things in a desirable way. And I know that, for instance, Benny Gantz, even though he thought it was a flawed deal, thought it was better than having no deal, as did others in the Israeli military intelligence. Secondly, and I think most importantly, the Biden administration will contribute to ending the deterioration of the legitimacy of the two-state solution that has been the paradigm for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. So there's been a real deterioration, as we know, under Trump, through the Trump plan, essentially revamping the entire understanding under Democratic and Republican administrations as right as to what would be needed by a two-state solution, by saying that all settlements could stay, talking about Israeli sovereignty this week with Pompeo, talking about Israeli sovereignty over settlements and settlements being in Israel already, and on and on and on, which also led to a complete deterioration of trust with the Palestinians, and then cutting off all the kinds of aid that Ambassador Kurtzer was saying may be reinstituted in the near future under Biden. So that has done a tremendous amount of damage, because there are other things that have contributed to the decline of the legitimacy of the two-state solution, even though it's much stronger than any other alternative in terms of support from Israelis and Palestinians and international and regional support. It has declined in many ways, and Trump really contributed to that. And had he been reelected, I think 4 years from now, that deterioration would have been pretty significant. Could have led the PA over the next 4 years to dismantle itself, and could have even led to a greater violence. So restoring the legitimacy of the two-state solution is a first step to achieving an agreement that would not only provide self-determination, safeguard democracy and security, but also restore a more widely held perception in the United States that Israel is a strategic asset, right? And as our own AIS member, Joel Migdal, in his book, Shifting Sands in the Middle East, points out to the necessity of the Israeli-Palestinian agreement to the US, to there being a consensus again that Israel indeed is a strategic asset to the United States, which is needed to further strengthen our relations. I think in that vein, I think there is, I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm trying to look at, I know, we all know the many, many, many challenges ahead, and Ambassador Kurtzer outlined some. But perhaps one silver lining is that Mahmoud Abbas, I think he already sees the missed opportunity of not negotiating further on Olmert's offer in 2008. And he sees what the alternative could look like under a Trump administration in the past 4 years in terms of the US administration and Israeli policies under Netanyahu that conform to it. So he may become more accommodating given that under this new Biden administration. And of course, already, as Ambassador Kurtzer said, reinstated security cooperation in anticipation of this new Biden administration. So I think, Biden has shown will restore some of those things, and Mahmoud Abbas may become more accommodating. Biden probably also learned some things from his 8 years in the Obama administration, and some of the successes, but also mistakes that Obama made. And I think Obama came in as a kind of a new person with not as much foreign policy experience as Biden, who didn't have the trust among Israelis, for instance, that Biden already has after almost 4 decades. And he made that mistake when going to Cairo initially of not also visiting Israel. So again, I think Biden will in some ways be in a stronger position coming in than perhaps even Biden was in terms of engaging the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So I think the Trump peace plan that now will be disintegrated before the ink had a chance to dry on the plan. And this will, the Biden administration will also kind of continue to weaken an increasingly weakened Netanyahu in Israel. As we can see, there's been 5 months of demonstrations against him. He's going to trial. Like in the United States, the pandemic is raging, and he's held responsible by many for not containing it and the economic damage that ensues. So when we see the possibility of a 4th election coming up, it's possible that he will use his political skills to maintain power, but there's also a possibility for the center-left parties to mobilize the leverage of a Biden administration and speak to their increased cooperation that they could leverage. So Biden also can leverage, and the third element I'll talk about is leveraging the normalization agreements with Bahrain and the UAE under a Biden administration. And so there's a real necessity, I think, to increase the normalization of other states, whether it be Morocco or Oman or Saudi Arabia, possibly even Pakistan, there's been murmurs of. But in order to do that, there really needs to be an engagement of the Palestinians as part of that. and leveraging that in order to press accommodation and make accommodation easier for both Israelis and Palestinians in engaging these other actors in the potential peace process and in the normalization process that is required. On one hand, there are additional challenges, as Saudi Arabia is not going to be as close initially to Biden as it was to Trump for some of the reasons that Ambassador Kurtzer outlined. However, perhaps because they're going to be under greater scrutiny, they might have a greater incentive to make some accommodations to further relations with the United States and then normalize relations with Israel. So again, perhaps things can move in the right direction there. I think that will also, if you get to an agreement, will kind of weaken Iran's power in the region and their kind of rejectionist front of Israel. Fourthly, I think Biden, the administration can increase relations between the US and Israel by restoring bipartisan support for Israel. And Daniel Kurtzer, I think, closed with that in terms of Netanyahu no longer voting Republican. But certainly there's been great damage over the past few years with both Netanyahu and Trump kind of tactically using each other to gain for themselves domestically in their own realms and really kind of eroding bipartisan support. And on top of that, as we just saw, there were 79 million Americans who, although they were voting for Biden, many also were voting against Trump because they think he's so dangerous to democracy and other things. And if the deep association with Trump and Netanyahu and Israel actually serves to disintegrate possibly longer term support for Israel. So I think Biden will do a tremendous amount to restore that bipartisan support, which will also actually make progress to a two-state solution more possible and is necessary to making that possible. And in turn, progress on that will increase bipartisan support, right? So both of these elements will work together to mutually reinforce each other. Fifthly, I think Biden will encourage Israel to not weaken its own democracy. I think also in the past few years, we've seen kind of Netanyahu and Trump legitimizing each other's efforts and taking kind of guidelines from each other's playbooks in weakening democracy in many ways, in challenging the media and acting like it's dangerous, challenging independent courts that are a check in a democracy, challenging other government institutions, both using very divisive rhetoric that increases polarization in both countries, which are already extremely polarized. So in that sense, just as we talk about kind of this trend of populist leaders around the world that are challenging democracy, perhaps, again, looking at things optimistically, Biden, who wants to set another tone, will set a tone that will also kind of flow, provide a direction in the future that will flow to other countries as an example too, to reverse those trends. So I want to, because caution my own optimism, of course, because there are a lot of challenges. And so some cautionary notes to conclude with is that, you know, I started off with Biden kind of making an effort to restore and rejuvenate kind of the pre-status quo in some ways of the Trump administration in some of these realms. But one could question whether in some areas restoring to the status quo is actually enough, or whether one could actually even restore things in some areas to the status quo in 4 years. So as Ambassador Kurtzer said, this will not be a priority for Biden given everything that's going on, or in Israel, it hasn't been a priority given everything's going on. In addition to that, it's likely to be a one-term presidency given Biden's age. And Ambassador Kurtzer, one of the books that Professor Nikolenyi referred to was the great book, Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, that he and Scott Lisenski wrote. And in that book, they critique different US administrations, and they critique the Clinton and Bush administrations for delaying having serious attention to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict till the seventh year in office. And while Obama tried to do that sooner, if we look at if Biden only has 4 years, one could see that they might have that same challenge as being perceived as a lame duck if he doesn't get to it till his 3rd or 4th year in office. And then, after addressing the pandemic and that hopefully being over, him running out of time. On the other hand, trying to retain my optimism, perhaps because he's not running for re-election, he might take the risks of trying to pursue this risky business. Also, it could be, that America's increasingly declining role in the region and Russia's increasing role and other region actors' increasing role, especially in Syria and elsewhere, just won't be restored that quickly in the next 4 years, and that won't be completely rejuvenated. And even if you get kind of the pre-Trump era status quo among Israelis and Palestinians, that's not going to be enough, right? Unless we actually make progress, as both Israelis and Palestinians have become disillusioned and lost hope. And given all the challenges and the economic deterioration that will exist, we need more than returning to the pre-Trump status quo and a real progress. And Ambassador Kurtzer talked about some of those things. Nevertheless, I think that of all the elements I talked about, the Israeli-Palestinian relationship is the most important one, right? And to restore legitimacy to that. And if we can reinvigorate the actors, and one reason for hope, I think, is the normalization agreements that have occurred and capitalizing on Saudi Arabia's interest, I think, in pursuing normalization, linking that to the Palestinian issue. So when we're all kind of become increasingly cynical every year, I think that's one hopeful point to look to that's actually different from what the situation 4 years ago, so that we could try to move beyond restoring what was the case 4 years ago and go beyond that in order to kind of bring oxygen back to the process and ignite some hope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aronoff. We are going right on time. Our next speaker is Dr. Tamara Kaufman-Wittis. Dr. Kaufman-Wittis, the floor is yours.
Csaba, thank you. And thanks to you and Yael, to Concordia and Michigan State for convening this fantastic panel. It's really wonderful to be here with Dan and Jonathan and all of you who have thought so deeply about the US-Israel relationship. I think Dan and Yael have done a really great job at addressing the major agenda items and talking about some of the concrete things that a Biden administration might do. I want to go a little deeper into the domestic context in both Israel and the United States to get at some of the political constraints that these leaders might be facing. So, just in the days after Election Day, I suspect that it was true in Israel as it was true in other parts of the region, that there was a sense of relief at the working level of this relationship, that maybe the capriciousness and the drama and the change, the changeability, the unpredictability of the Trump era might be coming to an end, and we can sort of get back to regular orders, something more consistent. But at the senior level, even where there is some relief, it's going to be much harder. Dan talked about the choices that President-elect Biden faces in terms of trying to reverse Trump policies toward Israel and toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's that's one component of what we're likely to see. But as Dan also noted, there's been a broader, bigger, effective vacuum in American policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a stalemate in the conflict itself that is a degrading stalemate, not a static stalemate. And Trump sought to fill that vacuum in very unconstructive and I would say largely unsuccessful ways. And so one of the challenges for President-elect Biden is to step back and recognize how far this conflict is from any kind of resolution and set a new course for American policy that kind of roots us for the longer term in trying to address this conflict. And that's crucially important, urgent work, because this stalemate is degrading, because this stalemate has been accompanied by regular violent conflict that has cost Israeli lives and Palestinian lives and economic growth. It threatens regional stability. This is a conflict, even with the reduced priority of the Middle East in American global strategy, this is a conflict that still has the potential to really cause a lot of damage and is every day causing damage to Israelis and Palestinians. So I'll have a major report coming out in a few weeks with colleagues from the Center for New American Security with our recommendations and proposals for how the United States needs to reorient its policy on the conflict and settle in for the long haul. But in doing that work, or any other work in the US-Israel relationship, I think it's important to recognize up front that the political space has narrowed for both sides because of the way that the US-Israel relationship has been instrumentalized by Trump and Netanyahu in the last 4 years, and more broadly because of the way the domestic politics of the relationship has changed. So let me take just a couple minutes to explain that. I don't think it's new for the US-Israel relationship to get caught in the meat grinder of domestic politics. Jonathan's book is fantastic on this issue, and I commend it to all of you. But the past 2 years have been a period of really intensive domestic political competition, both in Israel with repeated elections and maybe another one coming soon, and of course in the United States. And those 2 years come on top of a decade or so of sharper political polarization within both societies that has seen politicians willing to go to new heights in wielding political polarization for their own ends. So the longstanding dynamic in both the United States and Israel is that with isolated exceptions, national politicians have traditionally benefited from having a good relationship with politicians of all stripes on the other side. And they've benefited from being able to demonstrate that they husband this relationship, support, value this relationship. But I think that began to change about a decade ago. I think it started really at the beginning of Netanyahu's re-election and Obama's election. But it took shape, you know, initially there was a sort of moment of tension that was resolved when Obama demanded a partial constraints on settlements at the beginning of his presidency, and Netanyahu acquiesced to that. It wasn't productive in terms of the conflict. So it was a moment where a confrontation was dodged, but that moment ended quickly. And so the change really took hold, I think, beginning in around 2012, when after differences over the Arab Spring, then Netanyahu's old friend from Boston, Mitt Romney, ran for president against Obama, and Netanyahu made his preference in that race fairly clear. And between that time and the time that Netanyahu and his ambassador in Washington worked with the Republican leadership in Congress behind the back of the White House to arrange an address to a joint session of Congress in which Netanyahu would oppose Obama's negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran, by the time we got there, the dynamic was iced, in which there were clear perceptions that the Israeli leadership was favoring the Republican over the Democratic Party in the United States. And in a lot of private conversations, you would hear Israelis on the right express their view that they felt that the progressive American Jewish community and the Democratic Party were inevitably becoming more hostile to Israel anyway. And so the percentage for them was on deepening their investment on the political right. And that preference, of course, had an equal and opposite reaction on the other side of the spectrum. Democratic elected leaders and aspiring politicians felt that the Israeli government would not, as it had been in the past, be open to helping them burnish their pro-Israel bona fides in their domestic political lives. And that was an understanding that was combined with shifts in attitudes toward Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the political left in the United States that gave Democratic politicians more incentive to tangle with Israel than to cozy up to it. So you've had dynamics in Israel that gave Israeli politicians on the right incentive to tangle with the US. That's why you saw Bogi Ya'alon, leaking to the Israeli press his criticisms of the American Secretary of State. And then you saw those same dynamics emerge in the United States. And you can see the public opinion trends in the US in polling by my colleague Shibli Telhami, which shows that constituencies that are growing in size and importance to the Democratic Party view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a different way. They view it more through the lens of human rights and civil rights. And that makes them especially sensitive to aspects of Israeli policy in the conflict that have concrete consequences for Palestinian civilians. Things like house demolitions, things like the closure of Gaza have a lot of resonance on the left end of American public opinion. And so over time, I think what's happened is that for some on the American left, a Democratic Party politician's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become one of several proxies, like their stance on the Iraq War or their stance on Saudi Arabia. It's become another proxy, another box you have to check in assessing their progressive credentials. And so that has, I think, exacerbated the trends that I'm describing. Now, I don't think it's an accident that those trends, that shift in public opinion coincides with a decade of no active Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, a decade of rule by Netanyahu and mostly right-wing government coalitions in Israel, and a decade in which Israelis themselves have shifted politically in their attitudes toward the conflict. And we now have a majority in the Knesset that in principle supports some form of annexation in the West Bank. So these things are feeding off of each other. Israelis increasingly feel that there's a chunk of the American political establishment and the American public that is no longer on their side. That increases their affection for the uncritical embrace that they get from other parts of the American political spectrum, especially the Christian evangelical right. And it strengthens the arguments of right-wing politicians in Israel that Israel is under siege and can only rely on itself. So the changes are, number one, politicians aren't punished anymore for creating tension in the relationship. And number two, as a result, politicians are now speaking at the other side of the relationship as a way of speaking to their own domestic constituencies. So you see that in, for example, Pompeo addressing the Republican National Convention from Jerusalem. But you also see it in things like last year, Stav Shafir's video message to American progressives about BDS. That was really Stav Shafir strengthening her Zionist left bona fides during the jockeying within the Labor Party in 2019. But the big problem, I think, is that these dynamics exacerbate polarization rather than addressing it. They undermine the broader political foundation for a strong US-Israel relationship. And they have, especially in the era of Trump and Netanyahu, narrowed the actual relationship itself. So Trump and Netanyahu held things in such a tight circle. Trump, Netanyahu, Friedman, Kushner, Pompeo, all of them with their own interests in doing things this way, meant that the working level relationships were held hostage to the interpersonal relationships. And things only moved when the people at the very, very top had a political interest in their moving. And so there are certain issues that, have been kind of chipped away at in US-Israel relations for a long time that have made zero progress in the last 4 years, because at the working level, people didn't want to get out ahead of their leaders. And they didn't want to do anything that might, get them backlash. So things like the visa waiver status, which Israel has been seeking for a long time, and some technical aspects of maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. These things have actually, I think, suffered as a result of the politicization in the relationship. So as the United States works to build a new foundation for policy toward the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, I think these political dynamics have reduced the scope for the two governments to find a way back to harmonious engagement and cooperation. And Yael, maybe this is my analytical pushback on the optimism that you expressed and that I would love to share. It's true that there are some self-defeating actions that have been taken by each of the two sides that can be addressed and abated. You know, Netanyahu denied entrance to Israel to 2 elected members of Congress because the Trump administration insisted on it, even though he had already found a way to deal with it with the Democrats in Congress. You can address that. But there is grievance and there is mistrust between the two sides that shouldn't be underestimated and that have to be addressed forthrightly in honest conversation and overcome. I hear it every day and I hear it on both sides, Israelis and Americans. On Iran policy in particular, I think the incoming administration knows it can't simply return to the JCPOA. They said they would do it if Iran returns to full compliance. The Iranians are highly unlikely to simply come back into compliance. And I think the Biden team overall is going to put such an emphasis on rebuilding cooperative relationships with its international partners. And that matters in the region as well. There's going to be a lot of consultation with Gulf partners and with Israel. And on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as I said, we're at an inflection point. The fundamentals of the conflict are unchanged. There will not be peace without Palestinians achieving some form of citizenship in the world, some form of self-determination in the world. And I firmly believe that territorial compromise to establish 2 states for 2 peoples remains the most viable solution and the one that best meets the needs of the 2 sides. The agreements between Israel and the Gulf states are welcome for what they show about Arabs and Israelis' willingness to work together, their openness and their willingness to accept one another. And that can create a people-to-people dynamic that I think can be positive and may shift Israelis' perceptions. But they can't substitute for Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. And the ingredients for renewed Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are simply not there. So American policy has to be constructed for the long haul. And I actually think, and here's where I'll end, that some of what's needed in US policy on the conflict is also good for the bilateral US-Israel relationship. Here's my optimism, Yael. I think the US should not be pushing Israelis and Palestinians back into direct negotiations over final status issues. The conflict isn't ripe, it won't be productive, but the US needs to step back and engage each side independently on their needs, their parameters, their priorities. That is an occasion for the kind of forthright conversation that the US and Israel should be having on all kinds of issues. For a long time, the United States' focus on a final status agreement led Washington to look past or diminish the daily pain and dysfunction of this conflict, of the occupation, of this Oslo-created structure where the Palestinian Authority in areas A, B, and C, the situation in Gaza, the US was able to treat it as temporary because we're about to get to peace. But we can't do that anymore. We need to work to advance security, prosperity, and freedom now and in the future for everyone living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, notwithstanding the status of formal peace negotiations. And I think that's something that can help both Israelis and Palestinians feel more secure and more hopeful. And that can help shift the dynamics of the conflict. And the most important thing I think the United States needs to do over the long term is to build broader, wider ties across Israeli society, across Palestinian society, to get its own deeper understanding of the ways in which politics have shifted in these two communities, and to try and help rebuild bridges, both at the elite level and at the level of public people to people, to sustain and to grow the hope for coexistence, the constituency for coexistence and for peace. Now, in doing that, I also think there's a basic ingredient that the US and Israel need to restore the norms about not interfering in one another's domestic politics. I think the US ambassador to Israel needs to be absolutely scrupulous about it. And I think that Washington should insist that the new Israeli ambassador in Washington be absolutely scrupulous about it. But that is just the prerequisite for the kind of broader, deeper engagement that I think both sides need to engage in. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of our conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaufman-Wittis. And last but certainly not least, our distinguished lecturer tonight, joining us from Israel, Dr. Jonathan Reinhold. Dr. Reinhold, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Csaba, and thank you to the previous speakers who managed to say everything and leave me with nothing. I think I'm going to start with an Israeli view of optimism. I'm going to quote the former head of the National Religious Party, Yosef Burg, who said, "I'm an optimist. I believe yesterday will be better than tomorrow." And listening to my American friends and colleagues, I think they need a good session with Dr. Burg in order to get a sense of what it's like here living in my basement when I occasionally put up the periscope to look at what's going on around me. I want to take a step back. A lot of what I was going to say has been said, but I'm sure I'll still find something to say. I want to take a step back and look at the relationship from the beginning until now. And I think we can say two big things have changed. The first is that Israel is a much stronger country than it was. And that is true demographically. There are more Jews in Israel now than there are in the United States. It is true economically, diplomatically, and militarily. Israel is the strongest local power in the Middle East. Economically, Israel was totally dependent on the United States, aid from the United States in the first few years of the state. I'm not sure it would have pulled through without finance from the American Jewish community and from the Truman administration. And even in the late 1970s, it was American aid made up something like 15 to 20% of the Israeli economy. It's huge. Without it, it would have been a different place. Today, American aid is about 1% of Israeli GDP. If we didn't get it, our domestic politics would just be even more vicious than it is now. But we're in a different place. Instead of the whole of Africa and the Eastern Bloc cutting off diplomatic relations, we have diplomatic relations now with Bahrain and Sudan. We don't have diplomatic relations, we have normalization of relations and with the UAE. So the first thing is to sort of reset the mentality. The second thing is to say that for most of the relationship, the main issue was whether Israel is a strategic asset or a strategic liability to the US. That was where the weakness was. And the domestic political and the values and the culture were very strong and consensual. In a way, the situation is reversed, right? The main reason why people claim that Israel was a strategic liability, which was the cost of America's relations with the Arab world, is really if not being completely defeated, it's in a very, very major retreat. And on the other hand, we see that for the first time since polling really began on US-Israel relations, there are groups which sympathize more, major groups that sympathize more or equally with the Palestinians rather than predominantly with Israel. So those are pretty big changes. Okay, I'm going to come back to them as we go through this. First of all, I'm going to talk about Biden. Then I'm going to talk about Biden's strategy. Then I'm going to talk about the goods, how that may help. Then I'm going to talk about the bad, how that may challenge. And then I'm going to talk about the ugly, which Tamara's already spoken about, which is the domestic politics stuff. Okay. Biden. Biden will pass the Kishka test, right? You know, it was said of Obama, he doesn't care about Israel in his gut. There's no way that Biden's going to fail that test. He has stories about his father supporting Israel from here till tomorrow, which he repeats regularly, and his famous story about when he met Golda Meir around the time of the Yom Kippur War. He genuinely is very supportive of Israel. He's probably has the longest record of pro-Israel support in American politics at this point. So I don't think there's going to be any issues there. They're not going to be able to paint him as somehow anti-Israel. In terms of his strategic approach, we have, you know, the last of the Mohicans. I mean, both Trump and Obama pressed for a more limited American grand strategy. You know, we might call Obama's don't do stupid stuff or retrenchment, and we could call Trump's a lot of things, but you could call it belligerent minimalism. So it's belligerent, but it wants to step back. Biden speaks about the free world. The free world is like dusting off, you know, Cold War language. Doesn't talk about the liberal international order. The one subject which the Republicans and the Democrats all agree on, and this is greatly to the praise of our dear leader in China, is that China is much more of a threat than previously thought, and that the engagement strategy, at the very least, needs to be complemented with greater pushback. So Biden's a believer in American global leadership, but through alliances. And when you're dealing with countries like China and Iran, if you confront them as allies, you have a clear advantage. If you allow them to pick you off one at a time, it's a different story. So for Israel, an active America in the world is always good, because if America takes a step back, what fills that vacuum is either worse or downright hostile for Israel. So an America that is going to take a tough approach on Turkey, on Russia, is going to be more engaged, particularly if Michelle Flournoy becomes Secretary of State for Defense, your boss, then I think we're going to see more action, American in assertiveness in Syria. Obviously, we're not going back to George W. Bush or anything close to that, but closer to the kind of thinking that dominated American foreign policy from 1941 onwards. In terms of the regional peace process, I mean, I'm sure that Biden will support it and continue it. After all, it did start before Trump. It goes back to at least 2014. It was initiated by the parties in the region, not by the United States, when the Saudis approached the Israelis after the Gaza war. It failed not because of the United States, but because of Netanyahu's domestic political priorities. You know, I think he'll go with it. The paradox is the fact that the Saudis are so in trouble with the Democratic Party and the people likely to lead American foreign policy under Biden, that paradoxically, I can see them thinking, well, maybe we need to take a move towards Israel on the normalization stakes to buy some protexia, as we say in Israel, buy some protection in Washington against to keep the Americans from being too angry with us. So that is something that you know, I'll allow myself to be a little bit optimistic about. I think that what was said before about trying to entwine the Palestinian issue more into the regional is right. I think that the same goes for about restoring aid and Congress and all of that. I would say, and not reversing the embassy, ignoring the Golan, domestic priorities. Yes, I don't think this is not going to be a priority for the administration, except I think that they would take a diplomatic Hippocratic oath, which is like, don't do any harm, right? So like, keep open a two-state solution. If you do something to damage that, we're gonna get involved. Otherwise, I don't think they're going to get involved unless it gets particularly good, right? We see some conversions on the road to Damascus, unlikely. or it gets particularly bad. Maybe we see, and that would bring America in, the situation in Gaza heating up, or much more seriously, the situation between Israel and Hezbollah heating up, because that would lead to destruction on the Israeli home front that hasn't been since 1948. And if that's what's going to be in Israel, I leave it to your imagination to what's going to be in Lebanon. So that would bring America back in. And the other thing that could America back in is if Israel decides to poke the Biden administration in the eye by, by trying to annex something or expand settlements in areas that are particularly contentious. About Givat Hamatos, I would say that if the Biden administration made a big deal about that, it would be a huge own goal, because to most of the Israeli public, Givat Hamatos is immediately adjacent and lies between two Jewish suburbs of Jerusalem, one inside the Green Line, one outside. And it would just be seen as something that's inside the Israeli consensus. So if you're going to pick a settlement, I wouldn't pick that one. Okay, other issues. Arms sales. The Biden administration will be easier for Israel to deal with in terms of preserving its qualitative edge, because the Democrats are more cautious about selling weapons to non-democratic countries. It's an easy way for Democrats to show their pro-Israel credentials. Much more importantly, from Israel's point of view, I think that they'll be tougher in a non-proliferation sense on Chinese involvement in Saudi efforts to mine uranium or find uranium in Saudi Arabia. I think that's very important. I think China will be an issue in the relationship. I think that the Americans will get their way in Israel, just like they did on military sales. I think that Israel will come into line with what the Trump administration, and I imagine the Biden administration, will demand from Israel in term, and rightly in my opinion, in terms of not allowing the Chinese access involvement in major infrastructure or high-tech projects that could give them a strategic advantage, even though they're civilian. I think that's something that all America's allies need to do. I think that America, not during this administration, but going forward, might be tempted to think that it no longer has a major strategic interest in the Middle East because it is self-sufficient in energy. I think that would be a huge mistake. The fact is, the world is joined up, and China gets 40% of its oil from the Middle East. America's allies in the Far East get even higher percentages. It's increasingly hard for the United States to challenge China in its own backyard. In our backyard, it has a massive advantage. It is dominant. It is a very, very easy way of making the Chinese think twice. The fact that the US controls access to the Gulf, and even though China's trying to do things about that, I don't think that's going to happen. The most strategically significant problem in US-Israeli relations will be Iran. There are three issues by which Israel will judge the administration. And I say Israel as opposed to Netanyahu, and I'll explain what I mean. Sanctions relief. To what degree will the United States provide the Iranians sanctions relief prior to them re-entering the agreement? The greater the relief, the more Israel will assume that further down the line, the administration will make concessions that it does not think are to Israel's advantage. It will do that because it will see the giving up of cards. And it will judge that because what the Iranians did with the money they got from the deal was bung it in Syria. They didn't use it domestically to improve the standard of living. Now, people around the president seem to have mentioned that and recognized that those unilateral sanctions were far more effective than they thought they would be, which is interesting. But I think we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. The other two issues are the fact that Iran's ability to deliver a nuclear weapon is not included in the original deal. That's missile development and Iran's regional role of destabilizing terrorism, Syria, all the rest of it. Now, how much linkage there is between a new deal or rejoining the deal, but more likely a new deal, and those issues is another way that Israel will judge it. Now, there is a difference here, I think, in both governments. Here, there's nothing that you can say or do to Netanyahu to make him accept any kind of diplomatic deal with Iran. Okay? However, the defense establishment take a different position, and they can conceive of an agreement which answers the issues that I mentioned, which would be acceptable to Israel. For Israel, a military strike is a last resort. It's a last resort because we have difficulty. It would be a big ask for Israel and very difficult for us to repeat. The key to any deterrence with Iran is the ability to make the Iranians believe that if you hit them once, you can hit them again. And so there's absolutely no point in them rebuilding it. And that is the Israeli calculation. The American calculation, I think there are two poles. One is Colin Kahl, who worked for Biden and is really the intellectual architect of the Iran deal. I mean, he wrote about it academically before it became a reality, and he blushed when I said that to him, so I think it's true. And on the other side, Chris Coons and Michelle Flournoy, who have a more nuanced, a tougher approach than the Obama administration. And of course, as Professor Kurtz has said, there's the issue of Congress. Now, while Iran is the most strategically significant, the Palestinian issue is the most politically fraught for all the reasons that Tamar and Yael mentioned. So we'll take it one at a time. We'll take Israel and then we'll take the US. In terms of Israel, everything that happens in Israeli politics is about Netanyahu avoiding going to prison. Okay? Forget everything else. Israel is not more divided than it's ever been. It's exactly the same divided as it's always been. No difference. There is no greater tension, screaming, violence. In many ways, if you come to Bar Ilan University, my university, you'd see the opposite. We've had a massive increase in our Arab student body. And so far, fingers Magen Davided, everything's been great. So I don't buy that. It's all about avoiding prison. So what's his problem now? Well, what he's been able to do is keep the center happy and the right happy. And Trump's allowed him to do that because for the Israeli public, the United States is second in importance to the IDF in our security. And that goes for right-wing Israelis as well as left-wing Israelis in polling that we've done. That's very important. What it means is both left and right think that peace and territory are less important than the United States. Okay? So combining keeping the right happy, which is about annexation or settlements, and keeping the center happy, which is about security, it's something that's easy to do with Trump because you've got great relations with the US and you get to, have a wine named after the American Secretary of State from a settlement in the West Bank. That's not going to be available anymore. Okay? Now, Netanyahu's problem is that his right-wing competitor, Naftali Bennett, has gone up in the polls because in order to stay out of prison, the prime minister has been allowing the ultra-Orthodox to basically flout all the regulations that are to do with COVID, and this does not make the rest of the Israeli public very happy. So he's got a challenge from the right. Equally, so if he tries to compete with the right, then he has to do things that are going to put him in conflict with Biden. Now, if he picks a topic where the Israeli center, thinks he's right, he won't have a problem with Biden. The Israeli public will have a problem with Biden. If you pick Givat Hamatos as opposed to Psagot, right? If you pick a settlement that the US says is a settlement but is 50 yards from one of the major junctions that all Israelis go through when they're in Jerusalem, Somet Pat, right? Or you pick Psagot, which hardly any Israelis have ever been to. It's a big difference. And the other thing is Iran. So I would say that Netanyahu, being the smartest politician Israel has ever produced, okay, will try very, very hard to, if he has to have a fight, to have one on terms that are good for him, because it looks like we could well be going to elections in the next month, because it looks like we're going to have trouble passing a budget. That's Israel. What about the US? So, as has been mentioned, the Israeli public doesn't have a very good sense of American politics, right? So the Israeli public thinks that AOC is the head of the Democratic Party and represents, you know, the mainstream Democratic opinion. And to give you some sense of how little they understand it, Tamara was, you know, 100% right of the impact of Netanyahu's speech in Congress in 2015. But I happened to be on the radio talking about it and saying what Tamara said, and there was nothing I could say to convince the presenter and the people calling in that that was indeed the situation. What they saw was a cheering arena. That's what they saw. And so their assumption is that anyone who wasn't cheering must hate Israel. So that's the first thing. Now, what actually is going on is obviously more complex. For sure, there's been a change among young progressives, and half of Democrats are now liberals, right? So in 2000, half of Democrats were moderates, about a third were, and there were about the same amount of liberals as conservatives. Today, half are a liberal, a third are moderate, and about 10%, 11% are conservative. So it's a different party, but not all liberals are progressive. Okay, so liberals are divided on quite a lot of things, and there are still quite a lot of liberals who are pretty sympathetic to Israel, but they just don't like our dear Prime Minister and some of his policies. If the problem was just that, okay, it would be something for the long term, and it would be an issue, but it would not be an issue in the next 4 years because Biden doesn't listen to those people, right? Biden listened to the American left on domestic issues, which has been stated correctly is the priority. He did not even let them in the room to talk about foreign policy. And when they even suggested making aid conditional in some way on Israel, he just blew it out of the water. So that isn't the issue. What is more of the issue is that sympathy for Israel over the Palestinians, which is the most asked question, who do you sympathize with more? Sympathy for Israel has traditionally run among Democrats at 2-1 in Israel's favor. And here's the thing, between 2004 and 2015, the Democratic Party consistently was becoming more dovish and more liberal. And there was increasing criticism of certain Israeli policies, even ones on which Israelis have quite consensual views, like the use of force in Gaza and in Gaza. However, when you ask the Democrats, who do you sympathize with more, Israel or the Palestinians, it was still Israel 2-1, and it actually went up in that period. The gap actually increased. In other words, a more liberal Democratic Party is certainly a challenge to the Israeli right, not necessarily a challenge for Israel. To give you some sense of this, in 2008, Pew polled Western Europe and America, and in both it found that conservatives are more pro-Israel than liberals or left-wing, as we call them in Europe. But an American liberal was more sympathetic to Israel than a European conservative, right? America has a different political culture. It starts in a different place. And that's an incredible resource. It's not an endless resource. You can spend it all, but it is different. So when we look at it, even now, most Democrats don't have a problem with Israel as a country. Gallup's second most asked question is, do you have a favorable view of Israel or the Palestinian Authority? About 2/3 of Democrats consistently have a favorable view of Israel, and the numbers for the Palestinian Authority are about 25-28%. The numbers for the Palestinian Authority have gone up precisely because of what Tamara said. That is, there's a section of the Democratic Party who connects Ferguson with the Palestinians. And you can see it if you look in Google when they connect how many searches connect these issues when these issues come up in the US. So why did support for Israel nosedive? It dived for exactly the reasons that Tamara mentioned, which is for the first time we had a government that was only right-wing, because Netanyahu adopted a Republican first strategy in dealing with the Iran deal. It wasn't his opposition to the Iran deal. Let's just get that straight. It was the way he opposed the Iran deal. About 1/3 of Democrats consistently thought the Iran deal wasn't a good idea. And given that a large number were uncertain, if it hadn't been made into a partisan issue, he would have been able to make a case. And he couldn't win without the support of a certain number, about 1/3 of Democrats, right? So it was a stupid strategy as well as a failing strategy. It was bound to fail. It could not succeed. But the real issue is this. It's not these progressives. It's that even the most pro-Israel Democrats in Congress, like Steny Hoyer, right? He's never seen a resolution on Israel which he doesn't like. Even he and 200 members of the House signed a letter opposing Israel's unilateral annexation. Even the Washington Institute, right, the home of sort of pro-Israel strategic thinking in Washington, came out against it. Even the ADL came out against it, right? So here is Israel's side of the equation, right? For Democrats, keeping open the two-state solution is the key. All the optimism is very nice, but that's not the threshold. The threshold is don't poke the Democrats in the eye. Don't undermine what's critical for them, to have a positive approach to Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reinhold, for yet another thought-provoking and very insightful presentation. Before turning the floor to the audience, to give them an opportunity to ask questions and to address questions to our panelists, I would like to ask the panelists themselves if they have any comeback, any points to share with what they have just heard. And I would like to do this in the same order as we proceeded earlier. So I would like to give the mic first to the ambassador, Dr. Kurtzer.
Thank you. Really fascinating presentations. And I really want to applaud what my colleague said. I have two comments, particularly on Jonathan's presentation. Number one, with respect to Iran, it was jolting to hear him say that there is nothing that can be done to satisfy Netanyahu if the United States decides to go back into the JCPOA. And I assume that includes if we got something on missiles and something on malign activities, but I may be wrong, and I would appreciate his response on that. The question with Iran, in my mind, is you have to widen the lens aperture because it is not just a US-Iran or even a US-Israel-Iran issue. It also involves at least 5 negotiating partners with which the United States interacted back in 2013-15, and an international community. And the United States under Biden will have a large number of equities with the international community and with those negotiating partners that will also come into play. And therefore, seeing this only through the lens of Netanyahu, and even if you admit, as Jonathan did, that the defense establishment would support a serious agreement, I think does injustice to the problem that Biden is going to face. For sure, he will have to consult with Netanyahu and the Israeli government and the security establishment, but he will also need to consult with our partners in Europe and with Russia and China as co-signatories of the agreement. And therefore, I think there needs to be some very significant strategic thinking on the part of Netanyahu's office so that we don't end up in another spat because Netanyahu is so bent on the United States not re-entering the agreement that he doesn't see that there may be conditions under which we should. Second comment on Givat HaMatos. I don't doubt that Jonathan's right, that in a sense, there is an Israeli consensus because of where Givat HaMatos is located. But if the United States is going to play a role, whatever you call it, honest broker, third party, friend of the peace process, it also has to look at what the Palestinians are thinking about Givat HaMatos. And the same reasons that Israelis think that Givat HaMatos should naturally be a part of Israel are exactly the reasons why it can't be a part of Israel, because it will essentially cut Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, off from the West Bank. It is the final element of a strategic plan to isolate East Jerusalem from the West Bank. So sure, if I'm an Israeli and I'm looking at an Israeli consensus, build in Givat HaMatos. But if I'm an American that says at some point we've got to keep a two-state solution alive, and the Palestinians will need to know that they can aspire to a capital in East Jerusalem, then Givat HaMatos is a much larger problem which needs to be confronted before it becomes irreversible.
Thank you very much. Dr. Aronoff, do you have any comments to offer?
I agree. These were excellent presentations. Quickly on Iran, I also think that there seems to be, I'm not an insider, like in terms, and maybe tomorrow, like in terms of inside information, what's going on in the Biden transition, but at least from secondary things that I read, it seems like there would be a push to maybe include some other things that weren't included in the initial deal because it was thought impossible. And that addresses, I think, Michael Serling's question in the chat as well. Didn't the original deal not include things, activities and missiles outside the nuclear realm, which was true then. And I think then Gantz still thought that even though it had these flaws, that it was better to delay any nuclear activities than not have a deal at all. But I think in my sense is that indeed there will be an effort to have it be more expansive. We'll see if that works with other regional actors involved. I think I might kind of push Jonathan on two things. Even though I loved your presentation, it was very thought-provoking and we largely agree. You initially said that for Israelis, Iran was the #1 issue and that the Israeli-Palestinian issue was more of a political issue. And you may be right often as to the way it's perceived, but I would think still that it's very much a security issue as well. Even though we're not thinking of nuclear weapons and missiles and things of that sort, but in terms of actually the security of retaining one's democratic nature and Jewish majority, which are one's highest values. And then secondly, I think you made a really thought-provoking argument that things have been turned on their head in terms of whether the U.S. sees the U.S. as Israel as a strategic asset versus highlights the commonality of democratic norms. And I think that's something really interesting to think about. And I think you're right, the greater energy independence of the U.S. has has caused it to some degree to pull back from the Middle East. However, I still would say that there's room in the way you kind of perceive security and being a strategic asset, that I would still kind of argue that resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would return Israel to the perception of being a strategic asset, because it would not only be perceived in terms of soft power or norms or greater legitimacy in the region, but would actually have an impact of, for instance, decreasing Iranian influence in the world, or then moderating their stances on the rejection of Israel and other rejectionist groups. So it certainly would have strategic implications both for Israel and the United States maneuvering in the region. And then very lastly, you addressed both Tamara and Jonathan, but you addressed the influence of the squad, so to speak, on and other opinions that they have, which I saw in the chat. Leon Weintraub also asked about, what influence they would have in the administration. And Jonathan, you clearly said that they wouldn't have any, which I think is true, that it's not going to have influence in this administration. But as both you and Tamara suggested, unless there's real movement on the Israeli-Palestinian front, then certainly, even though if Kamala Harris is elected in the next election, and she is very pro-Israel as well, she may be more vulnerable to some of those pressures, perhaps, if there isn't progress made. So you're right in the short term about having no impact, but you're both right. I both agree with you in terms of there being concern for the longer term, which is why I come back to it being the central issue that all of us have raised, I think, in our talks.
Thank you very much. And the mic is over to Dr. Kaufman-Wittes.
Thanks, Csaba. I'll try to be really brief. First, I want to return to a point that Dan Kurtzer made at the very beginning, which is that we're talking about the Biden era, but the Trump era has not ended yet. And when it comes to Iran, we already had a lot of discussion about sanctions, but if the Trump administration really truly wants to block any hope of diplomatic progress between Iran and the international community on its nuclear program, there is one, forgive the pun, Trump card that they could pull. And I hope to God they don't. But I can't exclude the possibility just because of the nature of the man. And that would be a military strike on Iran. Let's not forget, it was less than a year ago, we were on the brink of a US-Iranian military confrontation in the Gulf. After the assassination of Soleimani and the sustained strikes on US forces in Iraq. I just feel like I have to mention it, even though I think the chances are small. And like I said, I hope to hell it won't happen. But we could be in a whole different world if that goes down. Secondly, on Iran, and on this issue of how you square the circle between the various international and regional constituencies that have a very appropriate stake in negotiations with Iran. There was one thing that was true during the negotiation of the JCPOA and remains true today, but I want to ask Jonathan how true it is today. And that's a big gap between Israel and the Gulf Arab states over their priorities with respect to Iranian issues, right? For the Gulf, it was always much more focused on domestic subversion, on the militias, on the takeover of Iraq, the takeover of, this, that, and the other thing. I have heard Israelis also express concerns about these behaviors, and especially given everything that's happened in Syria. Is that more of a concern for Israel now? Is the nuclear issue still #1 priority? Because that's one of the first circles the US has to square, is just between its regional partners, what's the priority on Iran? And how do we address that priority? So that's the second point. And then the third point is also a question for Jonathan. Forgive me, it was such a rich presentation. I'm sticking you with questions, but it seems to me there's an alternative pathway for Netanyahu and aspiring leaders on the Israeli right in particular in navigating this change in administration in Washington, which is simply to say, you know what, we lived with Obama for 8 years and then we got 4 years of Trump. Look what we got in 4 years. Let's just wait out Biden. The Republicans will come back around eventually and then we'll be back in the game. So we don't have to accommodate any of this. And I worry not only with respect to Israel, but other American partners abroad that the seesaw of American foreign policy is going to become something that they all learn to live with.
Okay. So I had the advantage of hearing everyone the first time around and therefore got to comment. So now I've been paid back with a series of things I need to comment on. Okay. Let's try and do Iran. Okay, so let's see, there's a number of things. To start with, Professor Kurtzer, look, when I say that there's nothing that you can say that can make Netanyahu support any return to the agreement, that doesn't mean there aren't things that you can say that will make him have to accept it, right? In other words, just as he didn't attack Iran in 2012 because it would have meant taking on the whole defense establishment and being in a minority, of 6-1 in the security cabinet. So I would look at it like that. But I think that in his head, he's certain that it's an all or nothing thing and that he's serious about that. There's 1,000,001 things he's not serious about, but that he is serious about. In terms of how Israel more broadly sees it, for the defense establishment, it was less a case that the deal was, good or even okay. It was, is it worth confronting the United States on this issue, given that our strategic relationship has never been closer, right? In other words, even Michael Oren, a very stiff critic of the Obama administration, had to admit that in terms of intelligence sharing and working closely together, it'd never been better than that. And I'm sure he said it through gritted teeth, right? So, I mean, it's serious that. I would say that from Israel's perspective, however much it would be nice, in Syria, it's important that the Americans stay there as a kind of tripwire to sort of keep the Russians and the Turks from getting carried away. I mean, that's more to protect the Kurds than anything else, right? And not allow that, because, Israel's been flying hundreds of sorties into Syria, bombing. And as someone I know told me that they can't tell me, said it's a lot more than you realize, okay? So when we talk about our security, the Palestinians are not even second, right, on the list. But there is, when it comes to the nuclear issue, that is something that Israel and the states in the region cannot effectively deal with in the long run by themselves. As I said, even people who are quite hawkish have said to me, who have been involved in these things, that a military strike would be a last resort for Israel. And that's because of, in the best case, what the damage it can do. Whereas the US has got, sitting in the Gulf, the ability to go, oh, we missed, we'll try again. We missed, we'll try again. Nobody, no Russians, no Chinese, nobody else, if the United States really wants to do it, can stop it. Whether it wants to, whether it thinks it's in its interest, that's a different question. And so for me, in my estimation, I think that the nuclear issue is the most important. The other things are important, don't get me wrong, but they're on a different plane. Okay, anything else? Oh yeah, in terms of America, other countries' involvement, Dan Kurtzer said, yeah, of course that's true. But the fact is, if we look at it in cold terms, what Trump did and what surprised, Jake Sullivan on the record and other people, and me as well, is that American unilateral sanctions were far more effective than anyone thought they would be. And given that America's military power is still greater than everybody else by some huge margin, right? Yes, of course, in terms of it is much better to have a broader envelope of political pressure on Iran. But really, what really counts is the United States' willingness to use force if it doesn't work in the eyes of the Iranians. If that perception is strong, then that will have the biggest impact on how the Iranians behave. The only other tool that's really significant is the fact that if they can't sell oil to the Chinese, then they're in real trouble. So the Chinese is a kind of final lockdown, but for the Chinese, the Iranians are just like a card in some other game. It's not the most important thing for them. They buy and sell, they're the biggest buyers of Saudi oil. So, you know, it's not something, it's something where the US position is very, very strong, which is why from an Israeli perspective, if that position isn't reflected in policy, questions will be asked. In terms of the Palestinian issue, it's not at present a big security issue for Israel. The real danger is actually what you alluded to, Yael, and that is it's creeping annexation. It's a creeping attack on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And even when I talk to, you know, thoughtful center-right people, and they say, look, we have to manage the conflict because, you know, we can't resolve it at the moment, which, you know, I think is a reasonable perspective. I say to him, but we're going to manage it so well that we're going to box ourselves into a corner that we can't get out of, okay? Because we're not actually managing it. What we're doing is just allowing the settlement enterprise to spread and make it more and more difficult to draw a border at some point. And it's very hard to talk to the Israeli public about that because the Israeli public is still in 2006, right? Even more important than the collapse of the peace negotiations, right? Which is sort of the way we, you know, we've been tending to talk about it, peace, Palestinians, is from an Israeli perspective, okay, even though the peace process failed, Israeli still supported the withdrawal from Gaza, right? They're over there, we're over here. No suicide bombers, I'm happy, yeah? My children are safe when they go and eat pizza, I'm happy. When the rockets came over, and when 400,000 Israelis had to leave their homes in 2006, even though I think one civilian died, right? So, you know, you know, that's bad, but it's not a disaster. That means that Israelis are now in this mindset where they say, look, just don't talk to me about that Jewish democratic stuff. All I care about is that I don't get a missile on my house, right? And that's, I mean, it's a very hard thing to engage with, okay? That's where we are at the moment. And so the language of the Democrats at the moment, which really resonated with Middle Israel in the 1990s, it's just not pertinent to where most people's priorities are. And I'm talking about everyday Middle Israel. I'm not talking about settlers in the West Bank or people cheering outside Netanyahu's house. That's what you've got to work with. And I would say that, of course, the ideal solution is always agreement, right? Freely reached, obviously, with the Palestinians. And obviously, if you have two credible partners who believe in each other, then the amount of compromises that you're prepared to make goes up because you think that it'll actually work. But we're really not there. And so when you say, well, we have to take the Palestinian side into account, well, obviously that's true. But since Israel on the settlement issue has the power, and if you wish to constrain that, then it makes sense to try and use your power in a way to be effective. And Givat Hamatos is not the way to do that. You know, I'm not saying I'm going to live there tomorrow, right? I don't see it as a big issue, but it's not going to stop the Palestinians having a capital in East Jerusalem. It's going to stop one neighborhood, part of which was an Arab neighborhood that was partly in Israel before 1967, being part of a Palestinian state. You can still link up Bethlehem if you go round the other way, round Har Homa. You know, it does not prevent a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. It does prevent one suburb being part of that. But if you ask me, if there are people who think that there's a Jewish suburb which is by Ras Al Amud, right, in East Jerusalem. If anyone thinks that's going to be part of Israel if there's ever going to be peace, then good luck to them, right? There are going to be some people who are going to be on the wrong side of the border, and they're either going to move or they're going to stay on that side of the border and not be part of the state. Sometimes geography will trump demography. Most of the time, demography will trump geography. But in a few places, it'll go the other way, if it ever happens. So I get it. I understand what Professor Kurtz is saying, but since I have a very low opinion, not only of Netanyahu's likely chances of entering a peace process, but of Abbas, who always seems to have an urgent appointment in Jamaica when it comes to having to make a decision when President Bush and President Obama are presenting with credible frameworks. He can't bring himself to say yes, to say, well, why should the US pay so much attention to someone who at the end of the day, when the chips are down, goes on holiday? Much better to apply your pressure in a place where you can have an impact. That's my answers.
What a wonderful exchange. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Now we have a number of questions that have come in already through the Q&A and the chat boxes. We started a few minutes late, so if we add on, I hope the webinar platform can allow us to add a few more minutes. Let's hope we're not going to be shut down, but we have about 10 minutes, maybe maximum. So what I would like to do is maybe summarize and package some of these questions. Some of these are general, some are specific to some of the speakers. Then maybe give a free opportunity to the panelists to pick and choose and see what and how they want to answer. So there are a couple of questions about the different solution concepts, two-state, one-state solution. The question by Rhys Omer as to about whether to United States citizens, the two-state solution is seen as the best solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A related question is coming in from Alice Solomon in Montreal, asking the panelists about how do Hamas and Gaza politics in general figure in the two-state solution concept. And another question about the solution concepts from Lisa in Montreal, who's been reading more and more about conversations between millennial Israelis and Palestinians about the conflict. And she sees that there seems to be more and more support on both sides for a one-state solution concept. So how is this beneficial for both sides? So one-state, two-state solution concepts, the first package. The second package is a couple of questions addressing an issue you already talked about, the nature of the different constituencies within the Democratic Party. You mentioned the squad, and Leon Weintraub specifically is asking about the influence, potential influence on the squad on the Biden foreign policy team. Related to that, Noah Ogilvy, formerly from Montreal, now in Ottawa, is addressing a question to Dr. Aronoff, Yael. Yeah, you spoke about Biden's efforts at restoring American bipartisan support for Israel. How much harder do you think this will be for Biden because of the radical anti-Israel positions held by some well-known members of the Democratic Party, such as AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib? So this is more about the nature of the bipartisan former consensus on Israel, if you want to and care to answer the question. And there is a third question coming from one of our guests, one of our attendees, who is asking about taking a long-range perspective on creeping annexation. Is that not what other countries, such as the United States, also have done throughout history? In other words, if we tend to look at the long-range view of the Arab Palestinians, that Israel will not always be there, and that they just have to outlast the Jews as they did the Christians of the Crusades, perhaps we need to take seriously what might be the perspective of people like Netanyahu. So this is a question that kind of puts in a sharper focus some of the things that we have heard for the last few minutes. So domestic Israeli politics, solution concept, peace solution concept, and the nature of the Democratic Party and its influence on the Biden administration foreign policy. So we can have a free for all. So I will leave it up to the panelists to see who wants to jump into the fray.
Let me jump in first with the the one state, two state. I'll just take a minute. Look, at its essence, this is a decision that Israelis and Palestinians have to make. Do they want a partition or do they want to try to live together? I don't see any serious evidence on either side of the line that a one state possibility is what both sides want. From the outside, there have been a number of studies, Rand Corporation, we did one at Princeton, some others, I think INSS in Israel, on the alternatives to a two-state solution. And they always come up with the outcome that there really isn't an alternative that everybody's going to be happy with other than partition, which nobody is really happy with, but it's the least objectionable of the possibilities. So, you know, what you're left with, it's almost like a doctor diagnosing. You discard all of the possibilities until you're left with the one that you think is the real one. And the real one here is a two-state outcome. That does not mean that, as Tamara indicated earlier, that we should not be paying attention to the civil and human rights discourse. In other words, the situation on the ground, which in a period of creeping annexation continues to get worse. But that doesn't necessarily substitute for partition, which is an outcome to which I think both sides still aspire, even if politically they're not ready to make the decisions necessary to get there.
Thank you, Ambassador Kurtzer. Anybody? Yes, please, Tamara.
Yeah, let me just follow up very quickly on Dan's points with the data that we have on Americans' attitudes toward the two-state solution. And, you know, two-state solution is less popular with both Israelis and Palestinians, but it seems to be more a function of their lack of faith in its ability to come about than that they don't prefer it to other outcomes. They just don't think it's realistic. On the American side, the public opinion data reflects what you would expect from Americans, which is that they favor a two-state solution. They like Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. But if a two-state solution is no longer in the offing and Americans are asked the same question that Israelis are often asked, which is more important, Israel's Jewishness or Israel's democracy? Israeli Jews say in large numbers, Jewishness. Americans say democracy. And so their second best option is one state with equal rights for all. Now, that's not out of some deep engagement with the issue. We're a democratic, multi-ethnic society, and that's just our sort of starting lens on the question. But I do think that the divergence between Israeli Jewish and American broad public opinion on that issue will have political implications if and when Americans conclude that two states are no longer in the table. If Israel were to take steps that were to make it an explicit part of Israeli government policy that it was no longer committed to working toward a two-state solution, you would see that public opinion start to come into play. It's not that it's necessarily going to push American politicians, but it creates an environment in which it is possible, there's room for American politicians to differentiate themselves there, and that, and then that you get into the dynamics that I was describing before. So
I'll just really quickly add an agreement with both of you, but in a contributing chapter to this book, Continue to Change and Political Culture as well and Beyond, I was looking at a lot of polls over the past few years in terms of two-state solution, one-state solution, where the legitimacy lies. And of course, I think for the legitimacy of it, ultimately what's most important is Israeli-Palestinian public opinion. And even though there's been decreased support, it's still a strong plurality in both that favors the two-state compared to any other solution. And when there are questions among the Palestinian public too, would you want to just discard things and move towards the one state? It's still significantly lower the support than for the decreased two-state solution. So I just want to mention that. And also for the question there in terms of a larger number of millennials perhaps supporting one state, the challenge there, and these panelists, I've talked about this, and Alan Dowdy in his book, Israel Palestine, is that they'll have very different conceptions of that one state will look like and who will dominate that one state. So while people can say, yes, I'm for one state, they'll have even more discrepancy as to what that one state looked like than they do for what the two states would look like, which is a real challenge, of course. So lastly, I do think it's what the Israeli Palestinians think that's most important. And then people in the US and Europe and elsewhere will largely in the future echo, I think, what the parties themselves are asking for. So it's not predetermined, it could change, but that's the main kind of thrust of that wider, I think, public opinion change.
Okay. I don't think there is a one-state solution. And Jeremy Ben-Ami said that, not me. And he's the head of J Street. So I think he's right. I mean, I think that what Yael said, just to give you, what it really, that's the polite way of putting it. What it really means, if an Israeli says they support a one-state solution, then 90% of them have in mind a non-democratic one-state solution in which Palestinians do not have equal rights. And when Palestinians say one-state solution, if you look at the polling done by the Washington Institute, nearly all of them mean exactly the same, but the other way around, right? So most people who support a one-state solution have malicious intent, and there are a few naive people who also support it, right? But, I call it the Bosnia-Rwanda solution. I mean, 600,000 dead in Syria, ethnic conflict. Look at Lebanon, ruined. Iraq, even Britain, the most stable political country in the world, leaving Brexit, Scottish independence. You want to play with nationalism? You want more playing with nationalism? You think, I mean, honestly. As for the Netanyahu perspective, I'm not sure it is his perspective, actually. As I said, I don't think at the moment he's really thinking about anything like that, seriously. But I'm not sure he's actually against partition. I think he just wants to manage the conflict through a partition that would be unacceptable to the Palestinians. I think that the Trump plan is pretty close to what Netanyahu would like. He might have even drawn it for him, for all I know. And I think when you compare it, what can I say? Normatively, I don't want to have a state in which Israel is not a democracy, right? So I will put it on the table. But let's throw that out the window for 1 minute and say, could you do like America? Could you just overcome the natives? Well, we'd have to have massive immigration. There's not going to be a massive Jewish immigration. And if it was a massive non-Jewish immigration, that would defeat the purpose for which the state was set up, according to the people who want a one-state Jewish solution. So Israel doesn't really have that option. It just doesn't exist. The only place it could exist is if there's some terrible conflict going on and terrible things happen in terrible conflicts. But who wants to be in a terrible conflict and do terrible things? I mean, so before one of my children comes in and tells me to get off the Zoom, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much. What a way to end this wonderful intellectual tour de force. It is now my turn to thank the participants, the panelists, the ambassador, Dr. Kurzer, Dr. Aronoff, Dr. Kaufman-Wittis, and Dr. Reinhold, for accepting our invitation to participate in this wonderful joint effort, which is what panel discussion was. Normally at this point, I would like to ask the audience to join me in a round of applause. I can only ask them to do so virtually. So I hope everybody will try to do this in front of your screens to express our thanks for all the wisdom and the insight that you brought to our morning, afternoon, or evening hours. Now on behalf of the Association for Israel Studies, the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel at Michigan State University, and the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia University, I am now calling the end of this important engagement. To our American guests and friends, we would like to wish a very happy Thanksgiving, upcoming Thanksgiving. And Yael, permit me to say this, but a huge thank you to your staff, Michal, Liana, for taking time away from their Sunday to help us bring this important event to everybody's screens. And also huge thanks to Jennifer and Lisa in Montreal, my staff, who were on standby in case anything went wrong on the Montreal end of things. Wishing everyone a very happy and nice rest of the weekend, and wishing everyone, of course, only good health. Be well, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.